Welcome, everyone. We are very excited to have this, what I believe is the 7th PANAAWTM webinar. PANAAWTM stands for Pacific, Asian, and North American Asian Women in Theology and Ministry, which is now almost 40 years old as an organization, organized and run by volunteers. My name is Heike Pekun, she, her pronouns, from Eastern Mennonite University in Virginia, and welcome to today's conversation. We want to offer you a glimpse into a collaborative work of PANAAWTM members who processed the renewed rise in anti-Asian hate during the early years of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. And out of those conversations came a yearning for anti-racist engagement that goes beyond and outside the black-white binary of racism and anti-racist discourse. So out of these conversations, a book project emerged called Embodying Anti-Racist Christianity, Asian American Theological Resources for Anti-Racism. And that project was guided by the steady and very supportive vision and support of Dr. Konju Christine Pei and Dr. Boyoung Lee. And so in this webinar, you will hear Asian American investigations into texts, particularly biblical texts, and hear offerings of anti-racist reading strategies and Asian American solidarity and resistance strategies. So the way this webinar will unfold is that we will first hear from one of the editors, Dr. Pei, who will introduce the overall book project to us, and then we will hear from 3 of the authors who will share some of their work. After that, we will have 2 respondents, Dr. Rita Nakashima-Brock and Dr. Tracy West, who will engage our presenters. And then there will be time for Q&A, and I will monitor the chat. So if you have questions for authors, please write them into the chat, and I will monitor that for our time at the end. So again, welcome. I will first introduce the authors briefly in the order of their appearance, and then after each present their work, I will introduce our respondents, and then that is how we will go about it. So, like I said, first, Dr. Konju Christine Pei will introduce the project. She is Professor of Religion and Ethics and Women's and Gender Studies and Chair of the Department of Religion at Denison University. She focuses on Asian and Asian American feminist theology and ethics in her research on transnational feminist ethics, religious ethics of peace and war, U.S. militarism, and faith-based peace activism. She's also the author of Trans-Pacific Imagination of Theology, Ethics, and Spiritual Activism, Doing Feminist Ethics Transnationally. Our first author will then be Dr. Yi-Jan Lin. She's Associate Professor of New Testament at Yale Divinity School and works on immigration, critical race theory, and textual criticism. In her studies, she investigates the use of revelation in political discourse surrounding American immigration. Out this fall will be Immigration and Apocalypse with Yale Press. She examines metaphors of race, evolution, and genetic inheritance in the field of textual criticism in the erotic life of manuscripts, another work of hers. Dr. Jin Young Choi is Professor of New Testament and Christian Origins and the Baptist Missionary Training School Professorial Chair in Biblical Studies at Colgate Rochester Crozer Divinity School. She weaves together post-colonial feminist criticism and diaspora studies in her focus on intersections of race, ethnicity, gender and sexuality, class, empire, and early Christianity. And she's also the author of Post-Colonial Discipleship of Embodiment, an Asian and Asian American feminist reading of the Gospel of Mark. And then Sharon Jacob. Dr. Sharon Jacob is the visiting professor of New Testament and post-colonial studies at Claremont School of Theology, focusing on gender and sexuality studies, feminist theory, race and whiteness theory, post-colonial theory. She's the author of Reading Mary Alongside Indian Surrogate Mothers, working on a project, and is also working on a project on the rise of religious nationalism in a global context. So welcome, esteemed PANAAWTM members and guests. And without further ado, Dr. Pei, your turn.
Okay, So this book, Embodying Anti-Racist Christianity, is the product of years-long friendship and collective care nurtured through PANAAWTM. During the COVID lockdown, swept with the Black Lives Matter movement after the death of George Floyd Thomas, Nami Kim, Anjo Boyoung-lee, and I had serious conversations about the intersection of anti-Asian racism and anti-Black racism in the United States and beyond. And our conversation were turned into a grant proposal drafted by Nami Kim and expanded and polished by the rest of us. The purpose of the grant proposal was simple. We wanted to create a space of collective healing where Asian American feminist theologians would engage with one another for serious anti-racist work, critically reflecting on anti-Black racism in our own communities and the historical construction of anti-Asian racism. Thanks to the Louisville Institute grant for researchers, we could create this space, which gave birth to the book, Embodying Anti-Racist Christianity. I think you can see the cover of the book. Okay. And COVID-related anti-Asian violence reflects America's long history of problematizing and scapegoating a particular group of people in times of social crisis. The various forms of violence that Asian Americans have historically experienced are intertwined with America's public health concerns, wars in Asia, racial and sexual purity, and more. Since its foundation, the United States has constantly faced problems in its perceived times of crisis. Native Americans, Blacks, Chinese, Japanese, Germans, communists, Muslims, Arabs, Jews, feminists, gays and lesbians, and Mexicans, to name only a few. The exhausting list of problems shows similar patterns. The American public singles out racial, ethnic, religious, or minoritized from so-called good Americans. Then the public problematized these populations and blames them for bringing crisis from economic recession to war, moral decadence, climate change, and even God's wrath. These problems, more precisely problematic peoples, should be contained, prohibited, banned, and erased for the sake of public safety. In almost all crisis cases, the blamed populations are not responsible for threatening public security, but are problematized and scapegoated out of public fear, often incited by irresponsible politicians and religious leaders. The uptick of anti-Asian hate during the COVID pandemic is a prime example of problematizing Asians' right to life. In a critical response to anti-Asian hate, the contributors to embodying anti-racist Christianity reclaim the Asian American community's livelihood, interdependent on the well-being of all problematized peoples. Theology always matters when it comes to social justice and injustice, because theological stories have the power to make and remake a world, shape and reshape moral values, and strengthening human dignity and indignity. This book showcases Asian American theological stories that aim to make a world with just racial relations by challenging and reinterpreting familiar stories. Yet the stories we tell make familiar stories unfamiliar too. Our personal and communal stories, interwoven with critical race theories, religious theological studies, feminist studies, and Asian American studies, may help the audience comprehend the power of stories and the unfamiliarity of familiar stories. Our stories will also show various ways of embodying anti-racist Christianity in Asian American communities and beyond. In that way, my particular chapter interrogates the role of U.S. militarism in consolidating white supremacy and sustaining anti-Black and anti-Asian racism, particularly during the early Cold War period. I argue that anti-racist feminist theology is synonymous with anti-war feminist theology, which demands critical analysis of racial politics from a transnational perspective and cross-border coalition building for peace and justice. My theological ideas are premised on the fact that US militarism is a persistent cause of xenophobia, racism, and interracial conflict at home and abroad. Specifically, my chapter analyzes how America's hot wars in Asia during the Cold War continue to influence anti-Asian and anti-Black racism, analyzing militarized Afro-Asian relations through the lens of intersectionality. I try to tell stories of a liberative God glimpsed through the anti-war feminist praxis of the Women's International Democratic Federation at the height of McCarthyism. By reflecting critically on Black and Asian American feminist theologies in light of anti-war internationalism, my chapter wanted to dismantle militarized racism and racialized militarism by revitalizing Christian internationalism. And working on this anthology was really fun. While co-editing this anthology, I also wrote my monograph here. Trans-Pacific Imagination, Theology, Ethics, and Spiritual Activism, doing feminist ethics transnationally. And certainly without this book actually embodying anti-racist Christianity, my monograph was impossible. So now I would like to invite my co-contributors to the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pei. Our first presenter is Dr. Lin, who wrote America, the New Jerusalem and Anti-Immigration Discourse.
Great. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see the slides that will help us. I don't know if, there we go. So my chapter, America is the New Jerusalem, explores the text of Revelation, but really in the ways that the text of Revelation, particularly chapter 21, and a few other chapters, have been used to conceptualize the United States and also America from the time of its European discovery. So it rests on the metaphor of America as the New Jerusalem, as the new city of God descended, and to be, ripe for the picking at the moment of European discovery. And so I go through briefly how there is the ideation by Columbus of this is part of an apocalyptic mission to evangelize the world and also to find
You were right.
to go ahead and take back the Jerusalem in a holy crusade, to fund that crusade. And it also draws on later Puritan understanding of this new place as really promised to them by God, so a promised land in imitation of Exodus, but also beyond that, the New Jerusalem in terms of establishing a new church state, new purity of church ordinance and governance, including civic governance, and even the modeling of literal towns like the town I live in or am near, New Haven, as kind of that 9-square grid that we find laid out in thinking about Israel encampment, and then also ultimately on the New Jerusalem. This continues on all the way through different moments of American discourse and understanding of itself in terms of American exceptionalism, all the way to somebody like Ronald Reagan, and of course later to Donald Trump. So Reagan describing the US as a shining city on a hill, taken from Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, but expanding that to think of it as a city with walls and doors that are open, like Revelation 21, in which the New Jerusalem has these golden walls and doors that are open, in which the kings of the world come in, and we welcome commerce, we welcome those who want to find a refuge, etc. So it's a very positive spin on the understanding of America as the New Jerusalem. But of course, so we have this comparison, right, of which, you see the kings bringing in the gifts and God blessed and standing firm with, which is showing strength and also defensive walls, but also as a refuge and a light, right? Those are the usual ways that we read American discourses of itself in terms of those who are hoping to come to the US, and really based on that kind of biblical language we find in Revelation. But of course, as you know, apocalyptic language has a flip side. So it's not going to be all shining, happy ending. There's also what we also see in the end in Revelation 22, who are outside, right? Characterized by the dogs, the sorcerers, the sexually immoral, murderers and idolaters, and everyone who loves and practices falsehood. So what I pick out from Revelation, also different scenes of describing those who are excluded, those whose names are not in the book of life, those who are going to be thrown into the lake of fire, or the whore of Babylon is held up as the opposite of the New Jerusalem, the bride of Christ, are characterized in these specific ways. So I pick up on the ways that that rhetoric is used in exclusionary rhetoric in the United States, and even during American colonization. First, in using that language to understand the place as a promised land, and then a justification for clearing the land as meant for these colonizers rather than for indigenous peoples who are already living there and have it as their home and where they belong. And then beyond that, when new immigrants come post initial colonization, the kind of rhetoric we see in Revelation 22 is used against it, right? And these will seem very familiar to all of you in terms of the bestialization of unwanted people groups, right? Calling them dogs, etc. Those who are practicing a different set of ritual beliefs and religion, understood as heathens or pagans, etc., as opposed to Christianity. A sense of invasion by those who are coming, so unwanted immigrants, described in that way, and then of course as sexually corrupting and immoral, also deceptive and violent. So these are the tropes we see again and again, not only in Revelation, but reused and recycled in anti-immigrant discourse in US history and American history. So I map that then onto the movements and the strategies that are used in anti-Chinese exclusion starting in the second half of the 19th century. So the things I sample to read this and to pick out where I find allusions to or direct borrowing from the text of Revelation would be newspaper articles, political cartoons, congressional debates, and all of these things. So some of these are sampled within this chapter to talk about this and to read really Revelation against the grain that we usually find in a hopeful liberationist Christian theology. To say that there are ways that this text has been used where, of course, we understand, God's kingdom should not have murderers, not have the violent, but it's very important to think of who is the person speaking, right? And how is that being framed? Who is actually being defined and who's doing the defining and the construction of a particular people group? So in terms of anti-Chinese speech and exclusionary laws and policies that are coming from that kind of language and reaction towards with fear and hate against Chinese immigrants, it's framing Chinese as particularly heathen, right? As not Christian, inassimilable, unable to ever be able to adopt religion in that particular way culture, and therefore also dangerous, violent, sexual, corrupting. And there's a specific move that we see through the literature and depictions, cartoons, etc. So Yellow Peril is one prime example of this, to show Chinese as invading an invading horde, and thinking of this as the invasion of God's enemies coming into a Christian land in a very apocalyptic move. We also see at the same time, right, with the whore of Babylon, she's dripping with jewels, she's decadent, she's dressed in these beautiful purple and scarlet robes. So there's the orientalization of that kind of figure. And strangely enough, the New Jerusalem also has jewels and shining, lavish decorations on its walls, but it's not as understood in a positive light. Whore of Babylon, on the opposite hand, shows all of these different elements that then are used again in congressional speeches to define Chinese immigrants as particularly decadent, as unable to work hard, right? We have the depictions of them as opium dazed, the women as specifically corrupting, which we see in the first federally enforced anti-immigrant ethnically specific law, the Page Act in 1875, against Chinese women, assuming that they are coming to the US as sex workers. So we see all of this rolled up in the language used. So there's a comparison of the Whore of Babylon with Chinese figures, men who are then portrayed in a particular way as corrupting sexually and also corrupted as the women as well. Beyond that, there's also the trope of, I'll skip through these, of Chinese and then later waves of Asian immigrants as particularly disgusting and eating what shouldn't be eaten. Here it is a rat, right? As compared also with the Chinese as a pest, as pestilence and plague. And we see this even more clearly in this particular cartoon, which draws imagery from Revelation, in which one of God's plagues that are poured out on the earth are a horde of locusts, right? And then they are shown to have faces like human faces. And here we have Chinese coming and invading in the land as a pestilence, as a plague themselves, being driven by an apocalyptic figure, the specter and the demonic figure of famine in northern China at the time, driving this invading forward to come in. And this is, of course, towards a movement of greater exclusion in US law and in passing those particular policies, because that fence in the front is shown as weak, right? It's not going to be able to hold back. So these are some of the strategies that are used in anti-Chinese immigration at the time. But what's very important in reading this for expanding coalition and thinking about this in a broader level is that these become the blueprint for anti-immigrant movements throughout US history ever after. So after these policies have been set with Chinese exclusion, recourse to them are very easily used again. And the same language is used and recycled over and over again. And of course, we see that with strengthening the border and the border wall and military along different US borders and colonization, and that kind of language to equate unwanted people groups with animals, with those who are sexually corrupting, with those who are unchristian, anti-Christian, idolatrous, violent, all of those particular tropes drummed up again and again that share the same moves with Revelation and come from this strong belief in American exceptionalism that's based on conceptualizing the US as God's city, as a place to be walled and defended, as a holy site. So this is really the focus on that text and the way that it's been used in American interpretation against particular people groups, and how that must be. We cannot, once we feel that there's some sort of belonging, right, then turn that trope upon others as well. So that's mine.
Thank you very much. Our next presenter is Dr. Choi, who wrote Intimate Encounters at the Unhomely Home.
Living in the diaspora, I have struggled with the idea of a home. For me, home is not a matter of choosing where I belong, Korea or Asia or America. Instead, for one in a diaspora, home is a deferred state of arrival from which I look back and see my own cultural history from the outside. In this ongoing journey, I encounter other histories. I grew up in a rural town near DMZ 2 decades after the Korean War, which was a product of the Cold War and produced the war that has torn the country and families apart. My father became a war refugee at age 14. Although he rarely spoke about his experiences, I feel as if memories of the war are contained deep inside me. As an adult, I moved to the US to study further and I experienced becoming an other in terms of race, ethnicity, citizenship, and language. By being othered, I was able to see more clearly the systemic racism, white supremacy, and exceptionalism of the US from my perspective of an outsider within. My social location and consciousness have influenced how I read the biblical text. For our edited volume, I chose to read the Gospel of John along with Toni Morrison's 2012 novel, Home, focusing on topics such as home, trauma, and healing. Morrison indicates elsewhere that race and home are the two most significant motifs in her fiction writing. She says that we live in a racial house, so in her writing, she tries to rebuild it into a race-specific yet non-racist home. Such writing always involves dealing with racial trauma and pursuing healing. However, in her novel, Morrison complicates racial trauma with trauma in a war. She illustrates the story of Frank Money, an African-American man who fled from the miserable reality of racism in the deep South of America to serve as a soldier in the desegregated troops in the Korean War. Returning to the US with war trauma, the story unfolds this Black veteran's journey back to his Georgia hometown to rescue his sister C. She had become a victim of a white supremacist doctor's illegal eugenic experiment and was in critical condition. After recovering through the communal care of Black women, she tells Frank that she sees a baby girl smile who might be her unborn child killed by the doctor. This triggers Frank's repressed memory of his killing of a Korean girl in the war. As Morrison's Home depicts an African-American veteran's journey home, I engage with the Gospel of John, which describes Jesus' life as consisting of multiple journeys. The ideas of trauma and home are distinct in the Gospel too. Jesus became a victim of state-sponsored violence by the Roman Empire. After his death, he visits his fearful disciples as an embodied ghost with his wounds. The resurrected Jesus is supposed to return to his original home, his Father's house, after his public life in the world. But in John 21, he appears again in Galilee, where his disciples now are. John illustrates Jesus' homecoming at the end, which I read as a haunting story. This is not the classic fairy tale ending, and they lived happily ever after. Instead, John describes an unhomely home where remembering and healing occur. Jesus, who died an unjust death, can return nowhere other than this home. His question, "Do you love me?" demands from the living an affective bond to the haunting presence and the ethical praxis of caring for one another. My interpretive strategies for anti-racist work, one of them is an intertextual reading of the haunting stories. I explore linkages among texts and attend to encounters of colonized and marginalized subjects across time and place. Reading Morrison's Home and John's Gospel, other ghostly figures emerge through memories of the war passed down to me and during my diasporic journey. My writing about home was like visiting intimate, entangled histories of oppression and injustices, and encountering the assemblage of ghosts. which continues to haunt the present. In Morrison's home, I encounter the enigmatic figure Frank Money, who embodies the arduous journey across the Atlantic Ocean to the deep south of America, and then across the Pacific Ocean to the forgotten world in Korea. Simultaneously, I'm haunted by the ghost of the murdered Korean girl migrating through the repressed truth of the Black soldiers' guilt. In close proximity, another haunting figure, the Yanggongju, who arrived on American soil as GI brides, haunts the Korean diaspora. This kind of intertextual reading produces meaning across literary and cultural texts and necessarily engages the other's history. Such a reading generates intersubjectivity among oppressed people and communities. I admit that histories of racialization and colonization of African Americans and Asian Americans are incommensurable. Yet I want my reading of haunting stories to invite minoritized communities to listen to the other's unspoken history that is connected to our own. This is why I don't approach the biblical text and history with the historicist method that only asks what happened in ancient times and what the text originally meant. When the official history obscures the unjust past, it requires another way of doing history. Through haunting, we hear suppressed voices. For me, such listening to erased voices is a way of doing anti-racist work in biblical studies, and this work is often challenging. Asian American scholars are invisible in the academic society. Our works are scarcely read and cited. Asian Americans continue to struggle with everyday racism and institutional racism, and we remember the histories of colonialism and wars in the Asia Pacific. Still, we try to understand anti-Asian racism in relation to anti-Black racism. When we learn histories of people's struggles against state violence, we can better understand how one's oppression is related to the other's oppressions. As seen in Morrison's novel, Black men, represented by Frank Money, are policed at home and at the same time carry out a police action against racialized others overseas. The military technologies deployed to expand US hegemony in Asia Pacific also suppress Black people through policing and mass incarceration in the US. Furthermore, there are reports and witnesses that the US and Israel have exchanged tactics and expertise in state violence since September 11, 2001. White institutions and dominant scholars ignore outcries of suffering peoples in the pretense of neutrality and objectivism, concealing their whiteness and political interest. We need to attend and stand against global injustices promoted by liberal imperialism and white supremacist racism. Asian American leaders are called to engage in coalitional practice and multiracial solidarity through biblical interpretation, theological discourse, community organizing, and various types of activism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Choi. Our next presenter is Dr. Sharon Jacob, who wrote Under the Master's Table, an anti-darkness and caste interpretation of the Canaanite woman.
Morning, everyone. Can you all hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you for having me and inviting me to this panel. And my chapter this morning, I'm trying to minimize the screen. Okay. I'm just going to talk anyway. My chapter this morning is Under the Master's Table, an anti-darkness and caste interpretation of the Canaanite woman. Before I begin, I must say that this was one of the toughest chapters for me to write. Part of it was because I didn't realize how much trauma I had experienced around racism when I first came to this country. A lot of it was buried. And a lot of it came out when I was writing this chapter. And I struggled quite hard while writing this. So I want to begin by talking about myth histories, which my chapter talks about. When it comes to discussing race in South Asian communities, these discussions are incomplete if we do not talk about caste and race as intimately connected, especially in Indian and Indian American communities. As a child growing up in India, and actually until I came to the US, we were often taught that the Dravidians were the original inhabitants of India with their darker skins and curly hairs and different languages. And then the Aryans come from the north with their lighter skin, taller, and supposedly descended from the Greeks. These folks entered into India and pushed the Dravidians down south. And this was a narrative that was commonly passed down from generation to generation to explain the color divide that happens between North and South Indians. And it would be later in life that I would come to find out that this history that we had learned in school right through college was what Romila Thapar calls myth histories. Romila Thapar says the Aryan and Dravidian divide is a construct of colonial scholarship, which has been used to create a sense of difference and hierarchy between different groups of people in India. There's no scientific basis for this divide, and it is important to challenge it. So we cannot ignore the political implications of these myth histories when we talk about colorism and bias towards dark skin in the Indian context. This myth history continues to exist even to this day, and some even educated people vociferously argue to explain why Dravidians are darker skin and therefore somehow inferior to the Aryans who supposedly brought culture and language to them. If it is not clear by now, myth histories are often used to justify claims of supremacy. In the case of Indian context, the Aryan and Dravidian divide, the myth of Aryan supremacy has been used to justify discrimination and violence against Dravidians. Every culture has myth histories, and as I move through my presentation, we will take a moment and reflect on some of the myth histories that have been part of your own consciousness that may have had political stakes. Alice Walker coined the term colorism in her 1982 essay, The Same River Twice. In this essay, she argues that colorism is a form of racism that is often internalized by people of color. It's a disdain for dark skin, and this disdain for dark skin is native also to the Indian context. We have words like Kali, Kallu, Kari, Karpu, which is often translated as black, that is used to describe people with darker complexions. Contempt for dark skin starts at an early age and is formalized through explicit and implicit messages on a daily basis. And to have dark skin is to be lower and therefore inferior. There's an unease with blackness in the South Asian immigrant community, which we also saw with the election of Vice President Kamala Harris, who is half Indian and half black. The need to quickly accept Harris's Indian roots while sidelining her black roots indicates the anti-black sentiments that are present in the diasporic South Asian communities, thereby suggesting that the roots of these anti-blackness begins at home in India. Growing up black in America is also a very different experience from growing up Indian in America, as Indians have frequently benefited from model minority stereotypes and the false belief that Asian Americans are smarter, more hardworking, or more successful than other racial and ethnic groups. It is a trope that has been used as a racial wedge between Asian Americans and Black Americans, says Nisha Chittal. And yet what is important to note, as we see starkly and disturbingly represented in Harry Kondabulu's tweet is that South Asian immigrants often buy into these tropes. And you see the tweet right on your screen. The question is, why is it so easy for us as Indians to buy into the model minority logic? What is our unease with Blackness? What is our unease with the term people of color? The desire for whiteness in the Indian context is often connected to colonial history, in particular the presence of the British Empire. However, as Neha Mishra points out, public disdain for Indian race created superiority based on white skin color and deeply embedded race-based ideologies in nations' darker-skinned common man who was ruled by the white-skinned masters, first by the Mughals, then by other European rulers like the Portuguese, and then the British for over 350 years. So the question remains, if disdain for dark skin was a consequence of colonialism, how do we explain that this disdain continues even after colonialism ended? So I want to argue that the introduction of caste, which predates colonialism, must be taken into consideration when speaking about race in the Indian context. Caste and colorism create a perfect mixture in the Indian context to shun blackness. Caste becomes the fundamental structure that upholds and institutionalizes dark skin bias. Thus, it is caste along with color that is used to cement a person's status and justify discrimination against them in society. As a result, the first reaction by South Asian immigrants cringing at the word color or dark is not just their unease with blackness, it's also our unease with caste. Anti-darkness is structuralized in the Indian context in similar ways to the ways in which anti-blackness is structuralized in the United States. They're similar, not the same. Caste more than color is significant in the acceptance of a person in Indian society. Color can be transcended if a person is born in the right caste and economic strata. However, a dark-skinned who is both low caste and poor is predestined to a life filled with humiliation and degradation. Caste is used to justify discrimination against people in housing, jobs, and access to water, as well as police brutality, sexual assault, and rape of women and young girls, lynching, murder, and many other horrific human rights violations against people who are seen as belonging to low caste or tribal groups. Thomas's words are illustrative of the ways in which both caste as well as anti-darkness bias seeps into other religions in Indian context. In other words, caste and anti-darkness is not a Hindu problem, it's an Indian problem. So now let me move or pivot to the story of the Canaanite woman that we find in Matthew. The author of Matthew begins the gospel with a genealogy that attempts to connect Jesus to his Jewish roots. The all-male lineage is interrupted by 5 women, 4 of whom share a foreign lineage. Among the 4 are Ruth, Tamar, Bathsheba, and Rahab. Tamar and Rahab are both Canaanites. Their Canaaniteness is never explicitly mentioned in the text, perhaps signaling to their assimilation into a predominantly Jewish genealogy. Meanwhile, the only woman to be explicitly named and identified is the Canaanite woman. I'm going to skip these differences and I'm going to go straight into evoking myth history. So myth histories of context are used as justifications to marginalize certain groups because they promote this false notion that their inferiority is inherent to their skin color, language, religion, and caste. The danger of these myth histories or conquest narratives is when they are taught or passed down from generation to generation without much critical thought. And this was kind of my driving question when I began to look at this text. What were some of the myth histories that were passed down to Matthew and Matthew's Jesus in this text? Musa Dube notes that the locations such as Jerusalem and Canaan were geographically loaded destinations that could evoke certain stereotypes and deliberate hostilities among readers. Although it views the land of Canaan as good, the Old Testament sees Canaanites themselves as evil. Matthew's use of the term Canaanite to describe the woman known from Mark as Syrophoenician highlights the nature of this woman and her daughter as the worst of the outsiders. They are the quintessential enemies of Israel, the one God had commanded them to exterminate because of their sins, because their sins were so extreme that contact with them, especially through intermarriage, would lead Israel into idolatry and immorality. The Canaanite woman is not merely a Gentile, but a representative of those people who are the enemies of Israel. Although we will never know for sure what Jesus may or may not have heard while growing up, we could argue that the author of Matthew is evoking certain stereotypes and relying on certain conquest narratives as he retells and rewrites the story from the Markan text. Recent interpretations consider the impact of the reader and explore the ways in which this text can be meaningful to contemporary audiences. Post-colonial biblical scholars have also seen this woman as a boundary crosser and view her response as resisting unjust oppression and focus on the narrative liberation. But as scholars like Wakpulan have argued, this woman is a representative of colonized lands and notes that this text is not about conversion because the woman never converts, nor does she become a follower of Jesus. The reluctant mercy that Jesus displays towards the Canaanite woman is troubling. Okay. Last point. Is troubling. He not only insults her, he ignores her. And the term dog causes quite a bit of exegetical squirming. The Canaanite woman, when she pushes back, she evokes for Jesus his own colonized status, and that becomes an important moment in this text. And I can talk about the strategies of how we push back and how we form solidarities in our discussion. I'll end for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jacob, and to all our presenters for such a rich conversation start already. I do not envy our esteemed respondents who have the task of responding to this rich conversation that's already started. So our first respondent will be Dr. Rita Nakashima-Brock, who is the Senior Vice President for Moral Injury Recovery Programs at Volunteers of America, and also the former director of the Radcliffe Fellowship Program at Harvard University. She's also the first Asian American woman to earn a doctorate in theology, and that was in 1988. And one of her many co-authored books is Saving Paradise, Recovering Christianity's Love for this Earth. And she will be followed by Dr. Tracy West, who is the Professor of Christian Ethics and African American Studies at Drew University Theological School, focusing on sexual, gender, and racial justice and gender-based intimate violence and clergy ethics in her work. She's the author of Solidarity and Defiant Spirituality, Africana Lessons on Religion, Racism, and Ending Gender Violence. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. Thank you to all the people who helped make this book possible. It's an amazingly rich resource, and I found I got a chance to read some of the essays beforehand, so I'm hoping not to mention things you didn't talk about in your abstract today, but I found them incredibly rich and highly recommend it for not just theological resources, but biblical interpretation. And all three of the essays today draw from all the biblical texts in ways that I think are really interesting and fresh. And so I'm going to work backwards in my response from Dr. Jacob's essay, because I thought there was a key principle you introduced in the way you interpreted the way Matthew uses the term master. And I thought that I've read a lot of interpretations of that story where Jesus is being racist or he's being patriarchal, and so the woman challenges his power in relation to his subjugation of her and calling her a dog. And those are clearly understandable reads of that text. But what I saw in the way you describe her not challenging his power, but reminding him of the status they both share in relation to the Roman master, was really changed that conversation. Where she isn't going to convert because she's not talking about religion and gender and all of those. She is talking about the colonized, oppressed state they both live with, which is actually true for everybody living in Palestine who wasn't Roman, as it were. And so I found that a really intriguing way of thinking in different ways about the biblical text. And also, I began to, because it's Matthew and everybody thinks, oh, Mark is the ur text, I think that may not even be accurate. That in fact, the whole idea that you need an original text that is the right one that everybody's drawing from and doing a riff on, as it were, and a variation of, is really a written culture sort of orientation to text. And I think, Kathleen Corley's book, Maranatha, makes a case that there are 4 traditions in the Gospels that come from the women in the communities. Which I found sort of startling. But to not think of the texts as needing to answer to Mark, as it were, in their variations, I think that's also a way to think about the complexities of all the peoples living under Roman oppression that might have become part of the Jesus movement. Because of course, he's also not from Jewish territory. He's from the north, which is more populated by Samaritans. So the fact that in the Gospel of John, which Dr. Choi draws from, that text, I think that Gospel of John actually it's first of all highly focused on Samaritans and could even have been a text from the Samaritan community rather than a Jewish or Gentile community, because the parallels to Samaritan thought and theology are pretty clear in the Gospel of John, with its intense focus on Moses, which the Samaritans expected the return of Moses as their tahib, their savior, or the person who was going to bring a new age of refreshment, which brings us to this whole idea of a new age, of the New Jerusalem, of a time when the empire will be defeated in the book of Revelation. So I found all of your biblical work really fascinating in terms of disrupting the need to find the correct texts that tell us the historical truth about the Jesus movement, or what that sort of historical Jesus approach to the text to try to find the ur texts, when in fact it may be just there isn't an ur text. It's oral. It's an oral. They were clearly oral documents for a very long time. And so they're actually in that way, I think, richer and lend themselves to multiple ethnicities and communities discussing injustice and variations of oppression and empire, because they don't all take the same exact approach to those questions. So that was just one of the richest things I thought that came out of my reading of some of the essays, was how you all work with the biblical texts in really interesting and diverse ways. And Dr. Choi, I really appreciated your troubling of the resurrection appearance, and how much it is puzzling that they don't recognize him right away. They're not sure who he is. It has the quality of a visitation from a ghost. Even when they say they touched his wounds and things, it's like still, it's like it's not a glory resurrection. It's not like he's suddenly restored to his perfection. He is profoundly wounded. And I think that is a theological statement about what it's like to survive empire. And because I work on moral injury, I was especially intrigued about the parallel in that John 21 story to the story earlier of Peter betraying Jesus 3 times. That story is like, it's really devastating. One of the closest people to him would deny him and betray him. And then in this text in 21, he denied him 3 times, you get 3 questions, do you love me? And so it's like, how do you restore someone who's done something so devastating as to betray one of the people he most loved? You have to ask for that love. You have to restore the relationship. So I found that your interpretation there with the use of the Black veteran and his experience coming home, really fascinating. Because of course, historically, after World War II, when the veterans, African-American veterans were treated so poorly after they defended their country in Europe and in the Pacific theater, a lot of them became civil rights activists, like Ralph Abernathy and Medgar Evers. Those were World War II veterans. So there was this strong military veteran presence, feeling betrayed by their country after they came home and couldn't get the GI Bill and a whole lot of other things that benefited white veterans enormously. And so I think that that story captures the imperial consequences of racism, even when there's a valorization of the New Jerusalem, the great democracy that everybody's fighting for, and yet people come home to defend that democracy and are treated again in unjust and racist ways. So I found that all of that, that bundle of things in your piece on home fascinating, and the ways that the woundedness of bodies haunts us, even when we're surviving and making do and moving forward. And let's see if I had any. Well, then the whole horror of the revelation, the apocalyptic imagery that I found dazzling from Dr. Yin. That one of the plague of grasshoppers and the Uncle Sam image in the Chinese faces was really startling. These insects, 70 million starving insects are going to come and eat up the United States. That is like, wow, that's a lot of power for a few Chinese peasants. But it was also it was just a very strange way of thinking about immigration that still haunts us, right? It's still part of the story that we're getting of right now at the southern border. It's shifted a little bit from being mostly focused on Asia to now being the South. But it's still the same sense that these hordes are going to come and destroy our country, and so we have to stop them. And so hence the battle between the federal government and the Texas government at the border with the razor wire and all those horrible things. So I found that the whole question of this apocalyptic vision of a New Jerusalem really interesting, because there's this connection not only to racism, but also to the connection of gender and violence with the Whore of Babylon and the killing of the Whore of Babylon, and how, sorry, my timer just went off, so I'm almost done. How the ways that apocalyptic stuff winds up being now in our own, in white supremacist culture, sort of giving violence against women and women's bodies in terms of Roe v. Wade and assaults and all of that a pass, because that's just part of the birth of a better country, is that we're gonna just sort of give all of that a pass because you have to have violence to have a New Jerusalem, and a lot of that is violence against women. And sort of, it doesn't ring in any way as a form of horrible oppression in that way of thinking about nationalism. I'm going to stop there. I could go on and on because the essays were so rich, but I want my friend Tracy West to have her time too. So Dr. West, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nakashima Brock. It is a privilege to follow you. So I want to be honest and say that I was not at all sure whether or not I was the right person to be a respondent on this panel. I just really thought, oh, I don't think I'm the right person. It's I want to say my own work insistently, absolutely includes work on anti-racism, but I am not a biblical scholar. I mean, well, to be more honest than perhaps I should be, I have a few prejudices when it comes to the lens of scripture and its relationship to anti-racism. I catch myself viewing it with suspicion and a degree of dubiousness. So often scripture is just deployed as a means of universalizing, of relativizing, of smoothing over social differences, social harms, social wrongs in order to orchestrate an expression of some kind of supposedly unified collective Christian identity, pointing to certain verses and pointing to certain narratives. Even those of us who call ourselves progressives will say, we're all committed to letting justice roll down like the waters and righteousness like the ever-flowing stream. We get caught up in the sense of what scripture does is reveal who we are as Christians, of God, as God's people. It kind of sinks us into this generalized cover up the real conflict-ridden differences among us, we. While anti-racism, it's, for me, does the opposite. The aim of anti-racism is to disrupt hypocrisies of Christian collective universalisms, to directly repudiate false claims of unified sameness that preserve status quo exploitative power relations, and reveal the painful, indeed horrific, evidence of the cost to lives, to dignity, to freedom of such universalizing Christian claims. But, you knew I was coming to a but. This volume, Embodying Anti-Racist Christianity, Asian American Theological Resources for Anti-Racism, and particularly these scholars, Dr. Lin, Dr. Choi, and Dr. Jacob, make me ashamed of my prejudices, of that suspiciousness, of that dubiousness. They make me realize all the wrong-headedness that resides in those biases and presuppositions. These essays deeply inspire me with awe. They evoke a really delicious excitement. They provide a brilliant tapestry that skills that really schools me in how to focus on how Christian scripture constitutes the work. The reading of Christian scriptures constitutes the work of doing anti-racism. In America, the New Jerusalem, and Anti-Immigrant Discourse, I want to just lift up a few of the methodological pieces. I know you've named them in your presentations today, but I want to underscore Dr. Lin really, truly shakes the foundations of my kind of mistaken bifurcation I just described, with offering a kind of really amazing critical ethical imagining with a laser sharp focus on particularity, teaching a thorough historical account of how Christian apocalyptic scriptural vision has been embedded in racist hate, violence, and discriminatory practices targeting Chinese immigrants to America in the 19th century. The Chinese were targeted, quote, as a prime threat to the heavenly city, unquote, of the New Jerusalem. Though, as Dr. Lin details and mentioned today, the colonizing implementation of this apocalyptic vision began with Columbus and the devastation wreaked on Native peoples in the violent reinterpretation and appropriation of that notion. But I just want to stress how Dr. Lin just rebuts any universalizing notion or tendency by identifying the specificity in anti-Asian racism, in the designation of Chinese immigrants in what was almost a kind of refrain by white supremacist leaders as a population, quote, who could, quote, never lose their identity as a peculiar and separate people, unquote. Dr. Lin describes how United States pundits and politicians made use of the Book of Revelation to support violent exclusion of Chinese immigrants labeled as yellow peril, justifying a belief in a divine immutable. I'm really stressing this immutable distinction between white Americans and the Chinese race. Distinctively, with the lens of scriptural analysis, the particularity of white supremacist anti-Asian hate is demonstrated it demonstrates how the criteria for New Jerusalem, it demands a kind of sameness in whiteness, right? This lens, we're able to see how this demand for a sameness in whiteness. And indeed, this essay explicitly breaks open the smooth over we in Christian collective identity. It breaks it open. Now I want to say about Dr. Choi's piece. Dr. Choi's piece not only excavates the nature of scripturally based racist project, for which anti-racist resources are needed, but also Dr. Choi helps us to see particular anti-racist tools that Asian American theological analyses based in scripture can provide. Dr. Choi leans into the transnational and transtextual with literary and biblical analysis, inviting this experience of being haunted. Now, using intimate encounters, using Toni Morrison's novel, I just want to say, just to reflect on Toni Morrison's novel is a radical act right now, because Toni Morrison's writings are being banned in so many places in the United States and taken off the shelf in public libraries. So to just spend time digging into this novel, but also putting it in conversation with the Gospel of John resurrection, this this interplay, it's a method of this kind of evocative, complex interplay of the fictional text about anti-Black racism and a Black soldier's participation in US imperialist project in Korea and his brutal murder of a Korean girl. Puts that in conversation with the Gospel of John, where Jesus's, quote, ghostly apparition in the wounded body continuously haunts his followers, unquote. These themes of trauma, haunting, and home emerge as primary in the anti-racist work. Dr. Choi's diasporic reading of Home hauntingly searches for a site where racialized American and transnational subjects remember the victims of US imperialist and racist projects. But I just want to stress and underscore the searching together, searching for home together. In both, Dr. Choi says, in both Morrison's home, quote, in both Morrison's Home and John's Gospel, home is not necessarily either an origin or an arrival, unquote. It's not an origin or an arrival, but it involves a desiring and making home together. That includes the painfulness of it. This theme of searching for home together provides an antidote to the usual competition model of anti-Black and anti-Asian US racism. That when we do this work on anti-Black racism and anti-Asian US racism, there is this kind of competition. And this model presented here, it defies that defaulting to, we have to compete over victim status. We have to compete over our group loyalties. Instead, in this chapter, there's this creative, evocative kind of invitation for this conjoined yearning that features a Black soldier that confronts anti-Black racist trauma and participation in anti-Asian misogynist violence in service of US imperialism. You see how the yearning and desiring is conjoined, but it's particular It's particular anti-racist remembering in response to the haunting. It's different kinds of work, although occurring together in this conjoined way. Finally, under the master's table, Dr. Jacob combines the task of defining a particular historical nature of racism with identifying the particular kinds of anti-racist tools that we need in this Asian American theological analysis that's based on scripture. Dr. Jacob gives attention to the too often neglected topic of phenotypic dynamics of dark skin, and in the particular context of India and Indian American communities. It's such a brave piece because it's like, we as Asians, we know something about racism. That's what this piece says. No. We know something about racism. And it even says before colonialism. It's like, wait a minute. It doesn't just say, oh, it's all about the Europeans. This piece says even pre-colonial times, we've got something that we need to talk about. And explains using this term anti-darkness. Anti-darkness is necessary, Dr. Jacob insists, because it includes this complex relationship between colorism, caste, and religion. That's what anti-darkness does in this piece. The chapter's analysis of the exchange between Jesus and the Canaanite woman in Matthew 15, scripture propels the anti-racist intervention. You see, this is yet another method. Scripture propels the anti-racist intervention, comparing the sentiments of anti-darkness in the Indian context with anti-Canaaniteness in Matthew. It's a reading that not only refuses to leave opaque the particularities of ancient socio-political context, but in fact, that consciousness of those kind of myth histories, that they pivot on a grasp of the socio-political particularities surrounding Jesus's status. And perhaps the most startling in this method, in this chapter, the most startling aspect, as Dr. Nakashima Brock mentioned, is the need to focus on how you read Jesus as the one in need of transformation, as the one who is being schooled, and the Canaanite woman as the one who delivers that schooling of Jesus. This chapter displays the particular power-shifting, gendered, body-conscious mind transformation of anti-darkness, anti-dark skin bias that a critical reading of scripture about Jesus can unleash. It broadens the meaning of racism to anti-darkness, and illustrates the confrontational practices that are demanded. I just simply want to say thank you. I want to express my gratitude for the cornucopia of an overflowing abundance of different, really different and particular Asian American scripture-based theological resources, confronting, engaging, particular histories, imaginations, yearnings, hauntings, dark-skinnedness. I need this for my teaching, for my writing, and my activism.
Thank you both, Dr. West and Dr. Brock, for some really appreciative but also thought-provoking responses. I want to shift a little bit from what I originally had planned and actually want to invite all of you who have been speaking in the last hour to respond to the questions that are trickling into the Q&A. We have one in there that I will read to you in a bit. But also just give you a heads up, we will go 10 minutes past the allotted time slot into 40 minutes after the full hour. That is 12:40 on Eastern time. Just getting started a little bit. So the first question in the Q&A that I see is a question about skills, tools, resources, and both you, Dr. Brock and Dr. West, already pulled some of those out, but I would want to open up the conversation and just ask all of you, how do we disrupt the myth history and the biases against darkness or blackness as the other so that we have more tools and skills in anti-racist work wherever we are. If you could maybe just like a short pitch for this is the critical skill or tool that I want people to take away from this conversation.
Yeah, can I like jump in? That's a great question. Thank you so much, Alice. So in my piece, one of the things I talk about in my conclusion is those of us who are from India have forgotten our own colonial histories. We have forgotten that when we were colonized, we too were restricted access to certain spaces. There were boards that were written out which said Black Indians and dogs not allowed, right? So this was and most people don't even know that, of course, those were in this part of the world as well. It's going back to our own context and recognizing what has been said to us and critically analyzing it and disrupting it, realizing that we actually have a lot more in common in the margins, and stop trying to access power by accommodating power. And for me, that becomes a pivotal point. It was only when I came to this country that I started realizing how much of the ways in which we were taught about Aryans and Dravidians is so problematic, and it's not based in history at all. Like, there's nothing about, Aryans belonging to the Greeks. I don't know why they do that, but that's a narrative that is passed down from generation to generation. So going back and realizing that in colonial times we were compared with dogs, and we also were fire hosed, and there was a lot of violence that was done in our context, which we need to remember and recollect collectively, before we come here. Yeah.
Thank you. And what others? What's your 1-minute pitch for a critical skill or reading strategy?
My recommendation is read a book. Boyoung Lee and I negotiated with Pelgrave very well, so book is not that expensive. So read the book, and then especially in the introduction, we suggested how to use this book. So the book has 3 parts, and then we have 11 chapters in total. And then these 11 chapters are organized in 3 parts. And we did not bring these the excellent biblical studied chapters together. Instead, we actually scattered these chapters, and then, like, for example, Jin Young Choi's chapter can be read together with my own chapter, and then how we understand the hunting and war and memories of war differently because our disciplines are different. So I'm glad that Dr. West mentioned her skepticism at the very beginning as a social ethicist. Yeah, I'm skeptical about the Bible too. And then, and again, Sharon Jacobs' chapter, Heike Packron here, and her chapter is excellent because her analysis of Thai food interwoven with the racism is excellent piece. And then, in fact, Heike's chapter can be read together with Sharon. And then Jen Lin's chapter is placed in the very first chapter of our anthology, because it gives us like a new imagination of how to read the Bible in conjunction to historical construction of images and also anti-Asian racism. So my recommendation is just read the book, and then don't forget to read the introduction, and then think about how these diverse stories from Asian American communities, in fact, are interwoven with each other, and yet they present like different disciplines and different ways of doing anti-racist work.
Why we invited Dr. West and Dr. Brock when we discuss biblical interpretation, it's not only about the text, just we address, we show how to use the Bible for anti-racist work and coalitional practice. And the title of the anthology is not embodying anti-Asian racism, but anti-racist Christianity. Then we need to discuss anti-Asian racism, but also anti-racism, white supremacy, US exceptionalism, imperialism among ourselves. I saw Dr. West speaking at a webinar. Then almost all participants were Black people. Then she mentioned anti-Asian racism. I was so impressed and shocked. That's what we need to do among ourselves as well, educating us and our communities using this kind of resources. So I hope that other communities will also use this book to educate their communities. So that's what I want to say, share. Thank you, Dr. West and Dr. Brock.
Dr. Lin, any pitches for skills or tools?
I think so many of them have been touched upon, but I'm so grateful to Dr. West and Dr. Brock for what they saw in these different pieces that I think, yeah, to echo and reiterate some of those points, thinking of, for example, Dr. Jacob talking about racism within pre-colonial times, right? And the myth histories that we have, I think particularly from my personal background, the characterization of East Asians and East Asian cultures from a perspective of Han Chinese, right, is one myth history that is rife in the ways that we categorize different Asian ethnic groups, and the ways to point that out for ourselves as part of a larger movements and coalitions against anti-racism, because those things need to be addressed as well, rather than thinking only in a colonial context. But at the same time, to read scripture critically, to think about how moments of thinking in my piece of triumph or universalism, as Dr. West points out, become highly, highly problematic, right? Where they seem harmonic or they seem unifying and promising in a particular way, it's always usually going to be exclusive, and to smooth down, often with violence, right, those things that are anomalous to that universality and to that kind of sense of triumph. So those and to read with the granularity, I think that Dr. Choi does, and thinking about particular moments and evocative images and feelings and strangeness within the text, and associating and thinking about more freely about what we can say, and bringing in literature and other poetic moments, I think are just so rich in thinking about what's possible with scripture beyond kind of that universalistic triumphant moment that we find usually in Christian interpretation and theology.
Yeah, thank you all. I wonder if there is anything particular that maybe our authors would like to respond to Dr. West or Dr. Brock, and or I was also wondering if there are any things that perhaps still haunt you, that these ghosts that maybe still linger with you, that are demanding to be listened to and healed with you as well. Because my experience was it was very difficult to write this chapter, one of the most difficult chapters I've ever written. And Dr. Jacob, you mentioned that too. So yeah, you know, in the few minutes we have left, why not open that that question?
So I can talk about why it was difficult for me. It's been about 25 years since I came to this country, and just last year we got our citizenship, and it was a tough move for us, because becoming a citizen of this country means we have to give up citizenship in India. And what does that mean? Right? So, because I'm still seen as a foreigner. What does it mean to now go back and you don't belong? You truly don't belong. Talk about unhomeliness, as Dr. Choi was talking in her piece. One of the reasons why this was difficult was because the racism and the trauma of racism I had experienced, but I have still yet to come in terms with my caste identity. Within the Indian Christian context, we were converted 5 generations ago. Our names were changed. I grew up in an urban context. And so caste is not explicit as it is in some of my Dalit friends and sisters. So in my case, I grew up never knowing what my caste is. And I think it was 3 years ago, there was a horrific incident in India where a low caste woman was brutally gang raped and killed. And what was really hard about this case was that she testified. Her testimony was caught on camera, right? She testified against these people, but the police still did not believe. So the idea of, the subaltern woman who speaks and you still don't believe what she's saying, right? That really came up. And during that time, it was during the pandemic where I started listening to a lot of Dalit feminists who talked about how many of them were Christians, who talked about what does it mean to be Christian in the Indian context, and why you get those second glances, those suspicious looks like, oh, your name's Sharon Jacob. And that, that hesitancy of like, where do you really belong? Because my last name or my name doesn't really say anything in the Indian context, except that I'm a Christian. And these women talked about how those of us who have benefited from this passing, if you will, if you go back and look in our own roots, you begin to see that there is a caste affiliation there that we have very conveniently ignored. And so while writing this piece, it was, and I'm still coming to terms with it. And, I don't think I'm done with this piece yet. I think there'll be a version somewhere else coming, maybe soon or maybe later. But it was coming to terms with the fact that maybe there is a caste, there's a caste affiliation here that my own ancestors, my own parents even, and maybe me are not comfortable with. So that was really hard and traumatic. Of course, the colorism, it just brings up a lot of stuff, things that you've buried because you think people are being nice. And then, it takes 20 years to realize, oh, what that person actually said that day was racist. So that came up. So this was a really tough piece for me.
I just want to say, I think it's dazzling how you're complexifying Isabella Wilkerson's work on caste, which I think is rich and important, but she misses the religion piece almost entirely. And I think that's a crucial piece of it, right? So I hope you do write more on this. It's a really interesting way to step into the question of race in America in relation to immigration also.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, I agree. I mean, 100%. That's something we don't want to touch. For example, maybe I'll bring it up anyway. The whole thing about Nikki Haley and saying, America was not racist. The first thing people will say is, well, she was born here. She doesn't quite understand caste. They will also point out that Sikhs do not have caste, but that's not true. Every religion in India has a caste, right? Every religion has a caste. So Sikhs also are casteist. Some of the Buddhists and Jains also have castes, right? And you see, even in Christianity, you see it really clearly when you go to celebrate communion in churches, and who's invited at the table or not. And that often gets missed because we don't want to touch caste in other religions. So yeah, thank you, Dr. Brock, for saying I'm not done. The first version was 20,000 words, and Boyan kind of had to sit me down and be like, Sharon, come on. we got to edit it out.
I wonder, maybe Dr. Pei, you might be able to answer this question just to wrap up our conversation. So to you as an editor, how does our book address intersections to other kinds of racial identifications beyond notions of Blackness? So maybe folks who are not Asian or Black, like, what are some of the entryways in which they might be able to engage this book? Then I will close us out. So like Afro-Latinidad, for example, or what might be in it for other kinds of racialized folks.
So there are a few chapters that make a conscious effort to bring other racial minorities' voices into their work. For instance, Sujin Code's chapter actively reads her memories, especially her father's experience of immigration in light of Asian settler colonialism, or how like Asian American immigrants buy into the erasure of Native Americans on North American soil. And then again, like Jin-Young Choi's chapter really builds up like how to read the different resources together. And I believe Jen Jen's chapter can be applicable to Islamophobia, even if she did not mention Islamophobia, but the construction of New Jerusalem itself has a strong component of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, so it can be read interreligiously and interracially. So just one anecdote, Jin-Young Choi's book, Post-Colonial Discipleship of Embodiment, came out back in 2015, and I refused to read that book because I knew that she dealt with hunting and ghosts and different things. And but then when the Embodying Anti-Racist Christianity project was conceived, I had a summer research student who wanted to explore Asian American literature and ghosts and hunting and so on. So I had to find out Asian American theological and biblical studies books that dealt with ghost and hunting. So I introduced Jin-Young Choi's book to her. So I had to sit down with this student and started reading. And then I found that this book, it's not simply about ghost and hunting, but it's actually liberation and healing. Then as a co-editor, I had to read her chapter for the Embodying Anti-Racist Christianity. And when I saw the name of Toni Morrison, I was like, uh-oh, this is too much. Because ever since I read Toni Morrison's Bluest Eye, I have been hunted. I still don't look at that book because Toni Morrison's writing, like Beloved and Bluest Eyes, really, really just haunts me. I think that feelings can be shared. So the Toni Morrison's book, Home, again, I feel like it creates a haunting memory, but then I decided to buy the book and then started reading Toni Morrison's book before reading Jin-Young Choi's finalized chapter. And again, I found that this is not simply about hunting, but like liberation. And then later, when I finalized my own monograph, the last chapter of my book was all about how Jesus' body can be read as a collective body of diasporas. And then how basically I argued that like ghosts come to our lives because they want us to be healed from past traumas, and also they want to be liberated with us. That notion goes back to Rita Nakashima Brock's book, Saving Paradise. And then in Saving Paradise, Rita articulates the early church's practice of the Eucharist that invites the living and the dead all together, and then they share food together, and then they experience the mystery together. So I feel that the book is an invitation of that mystery. So I hope like non-Asian folks, including whites and non-Asian people of color, will find the entry point. And then I wish they use critical self-reflection as they read this book, and then make a critical dialogue with these chapters.
Thank you, Dr. Pei. You gave a great summary of all the different conversation points, and another great pitch for the book too. I hope all of you will be haunted in a good way by the nuggets of ideas and conversation that we had in here, and the collaborative and collective liberation that I think was so beautifully modeled in these appreciative and like conversations. And I'm very grateful for this time spent together. That was also made possible by the Henry Luce Foundation that sponsored some of the work of PANAAWTM and makes it possible for us to do this kind of public-facing work. Again, a great heartfelt thank you to all of you speakers today, to everybody behind the camera as well. Grace Cow for being the great webinar facilitator, and everybody involved in PANAAWTM for being such a wonderful, constructive and passionate and inclusive space for many people. So thank you all, and I hope you all have a wonderful, fruitful time moving forward.